Hey everyone, it's Cosmo. So AI is completely changing the game on how we make software and businesses forever. It is a massive paradigm shift that is democratizing software creation. And I'm thrilled to introduce the very first podcast all about the subject called Vibe Coding. So if you want the latest news, tips, and tricks on how to make the best software with AI, definitely subscribe to this podcast and head over to vibe-coding.fm. So welcome to the very first episode. Today I'm joined by Ash Gobindram, the CEO of Kinemeric.
So Kinemeric is focused on spatial technology and kind of the marriage of spatial technology with AI. We're using those technologies today to create believable, immersive simulations, primarily for a corporate training kind of use case. But really what we're able to achieve with the way the technology is developing today are believable scenarios with believable humans in spatial, spatial either mixed reality or virtual reality scenarios. And really you're able to interact with these believable humans for various use cases. They could serve as theoretical customers, they could serve as trainers, they could serve as colleagues. And really what we're able to do is create these very immersive scenarios where, for example, if you're an HR manager or professional and you need to build that muscle memory on, having a chat with a particular employee who may have a performance gap or even something more seriously, this provides a forum to safely practice that and understand your performance in those kinds of scenarios.
Interesting. So you say believable humans. You mentioned the word believable a few times. Like, what does that mean in the context of what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me, and I think I have different opinions on different days, Cosmo, but I think really, being in the spatial technology arena over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been this idea of the uncanny valley where you try to create a human-like interaction with an NPC, and really because of an amount of factors, it falls short and it kind of gives you this jarring feeling. Now, I have my own arguments about, I think that's moved a little bit where the uncanny valley is, especially in interacting with the technology so much, but it's really getting the right sum of factors to create a simulation that your mind kind of interprets as believable, as opposed to something where you're there, but you're not there really. So that's kind of what I mean.
And how do you address the uncanny valley in a spatial experience?
Sure. So there's a number of ways. I think that, the believable dialogue that is strongly powered by the advancements in LLMs over the last couple of years, actually, in my opinion, helps to reduce it considerably. And then you have your traditional kinds of levers with animation, both, body animation as well as facial animation, mannerisms that, go beyond animation because you're looking to, integrate a logic in the actual linear flow of the conversation and trigger a mannerism that makes sense, as well as finally the quality of the avatars and, balancing that with where the technology taps out as to, where is aesthetically, kind of ingestible in our minds where, I'm going to have a conversation with this virtual being, but I can get into it.
Okay, great. So with Kinemeric, you are combining XR with AI for enterprise training. And I've always believed in, that use case as one of the most powerful and useful for XR, VR. I know that's, going back decades, that was like one of the early things that, people experimented with. Sure. So can you give some examples of like practically how, what that actually looks like in terms of the different industries that you're focused on?
Sure. So our first commercial deployment, for example, today is with a mid to large size construction company out of the Midwest, Wisconsin specifically. And they have a large fleet of salespeople who are taking in-person sales meetings every day, assessing people's roofs, their gutters, etc. And really to create a standardization and build the muscle memory to build that comfort level and become a successful salesperson in these scenarios, really today their only ability is to send these guys out and have them fail on the job and learn on the job. So what we're doing is we're creating, believable simulations with different homeowners in virtual and mixed reality, where these new salespeople can go in there, practice their pitch. In the first deployment we've done, they actually have a 3-phased kind of approach to their sale. So the trainee can actually experience each of those phases, try different techniques, and then also get analytics that, goes deep on the actual back and forth of that conversation, and gives them pointers as to how they can strengthen their pitch or their sales approach in successive conversations.
Brilliant. Okay, cool. So you're using XR and AI for practicing sales as one example. And then as it relates to vibe coding, are you producing the app with AI too, or how are you leveraging these AI tools?
Sure. So I would say today, in most of the stuff that becomes like a production platform or deployed to production, you wouldn't see those code bases kind of vibe coded out today. There's perhaps little facets or elements within the project or the product that have been created with some vibe coding. Really, where we're employing it today is much earlier in the process, typically during discovery. Typically at Kinemeric, what we do in engagements is we do a discovery and preliminary design phase up front. So whereas typically that used to involve, your typical, 5-plane UX process, very high fidelity wireframes that are born out of initial paper prototyping, and, kind of hitting all those successive steps. What we've done is kind of like, found a shortcut here in some cases where we find it to be a good candidate. And what we'll do is we'll sit down and we'll vibe code a little bit of what we think the experience should be up front. And instead of ending up with a set of paper prototypes or low fidelity wireframes, we actually end up with a pretty interactive, clickable prototype that helps, our customer or client understand the experience we're envisioning for them in a greater level of depth.
Oh, wonderful. So you're using vibe coding tools to support your projects at an earlier stage of development before. Is this in order to land the projects, or have you already secured the projects at that point?
I don't know if we've done that. I don't think we may have. We may have used some, vibe coded prototypes in a couple of, earlier conversations, but in the vast majority of, use cases where I've actually used a vibe coded, product and commercialized it, if you will, they've been clients already.
Okay.
Simply employed it in our, our discovery and preliminary design process.
Got it. Great. And what tools are you using for this?
So predominantly because I am the experimenter in chief with vibe coding at Kinemeric today, I like Lovable. I think that there's obviously more robust tools out there. But for me, if I'm quickly, trying to put together a prototype or, hack something out in under an hour, I just, I have Lovable as a favorite on my Arc browser today. I just hop into that tab and I start firing away. And, typically in under an hour, I've usually hit, whatever my objective was. I haven't tried to do, anything too much larger than what I would think would take about like an hour or under an hour. But, most of the time with my objective that I've set out with, I find under an hour, I'm able to have something that I think is pretty presentable.
Cool. Awesome. So Lovable is your main tool. If you don't mind, I'd love to see what you've put together with Lovable.
Sure. So we'll start off with some of like the basic earlier experiments we did, and I'll give you an idea as to, how it evolved over time. What we'll start off with is essentially a quick prototype that we did for a client of ours out of California, and they are a private equity, private equity firm, and one of the partners there has an investment into a programmatic lending AI solution, and they were dabbling with the idea of commercializing this into, basically using that technology to underpin a small, lending platform. And they wanted to get an idea of what that could look like from a number of facets for a couple of stakeholders. So what I did, and you can see the convo here, this was all done in under an hour, is put together, a simple little prototype as to, how the interface could look and feel ultimately. And, we actually shared this out there with a bunch of stakeholders. It actually ended up evolving into a landing page for us to start to drive, signups on and understand more so what the demand is. It's correlated with some other products and some other initiatives we're working on. But really, we were able to achieve this in under an hour, which is pretty impressive.
Cool. And just to describe it for those listening, we're looking at a website that has a slider where you can drag some money numbers around. And what was what was the client's reaction to this?
They were super happy. It allowed them to take the prototype, go out there, speak with some potential investors about where they were going with the idea. And really it helped them gather the data they needed at that point in the conversation in a much more, I would say, stronger fashion than presenting, a deck with a bunch of wireframes or a bunch of, UI designs. It was actually something that was tangible and, moving along and done very, very quickly. I think, we had a conversation a day before that about the potential to commercialize the underpinning technology. And we were able to spin up something, meaningful for them within a day.
Awesome. Wonderful. And I'm curious if there's other things you might want to share.
Yeah, for sure. So this was the first experiment that I would say was kind of commercialized in a sense. And as you may know, Cosmo, for Kinemeric, one of our longstanding clients is Richemont, who's actually the parent company of a number of storied watchmakers and jewelry companies. So we help them with a lot of their spatial initiatives and understanding how spatial technology can evolve their business. So we've been talking with them for some time now about how heads-up displays could accentuate and create greater efficiencies in their service centers. So we isolated, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the RealWear One headset, which is kind of a pseudo MR device. But basically what it does is it's a headset and it gives you kind of a 7-inch display. So it's a very small display, but with magnification and the placement, it appears like a 7 or 8-inch tablet in your field of view. So we're big believers that this technology could be tremendously useful in a number of service centers across the world. So to create a deeper, understanding and visualization of how that could actually, work in their service center, what we did was we actually took a pseudo procedure and we started to break it down for, how it would display on a RealWear device through a vibe-coded prototype. So that's what we're looking at here. This is a simple assembly, simple welcome screen, and a simple step-by-step process that guides you through a procedure or assembly. And we tied this up with a RealWear headset, and basically deployed a prototype for our client to understand how this technology could be leveraged in their service centers. And essentially, there were 2 turns on this prototype, and that's another little topic we could jump into, some of the lessons of vibe coding. But really, we did 2 turns on this prototype. I'll show you the first turn real quick.
Yeah, cool. And real quick, so just to describe what we're looking at these diagrams of watches that are instructions for people to repair watches. Is that accurate?
Correct. These are, rather complex automatic movements, and, they are serviced here in the United States. And there's a wide array of movements that watch tech could come across on any given day. So creating better resources and tools with the technology to make their jobs as easy and efficient as possible. So touching back on what I was mentioning before is that this was the initial prototype you could see here, Cosmo. And, there were a number of things that turned out not quite how we wanted them in this initial, vibe-coded approach. So that's kind of one of the drawbacks of vibe coding sometimes is that, obviously there's rollback features and it's arguable how well they work. Sometimes I find that when I roll things back on Lovable, sometimes they're not truly rolled back. There's a couple of sticky bits. But essentially, sometimes with vibe coding, it's kind of like going down a path. And, one prompt could kind of lead to your next prompt and the prompt thereafter not quite working the way you want them to. And, sometimes, you actually, if you find yourself in a place, you might have to, scrap that particular vibe coded prototype and, start afresh, but with a much better idea of the succession of prompts you want to use in order to achieve the goals that you want. So this is an example of one that I took down the wrong path. And then ultimately I used the learnings and then I started a fresh project. And then in, probably under 45 minutes, I was able to get out the version that we ultimately shared with our client.
Interesting. So you found it easier to just start from scratch instead of working on the one you already had going.
Oh yeah, because sometimes it feels like you're stuck in a spider web and like trying to get one thing done, but then you're dealing with two other issues cropping up on you. So sometimes I do feel like it's better to start with a new project, especially if you have like a clear set of 3 or 4 prompts articulated in your mind. That's going to get you really close to the result, right? Whereas like sometimes when you start fresh, you're really vibe coding, you're like reacting, step by step. You're like, oh, let's do this, let's do that, and then you find yourself in a place where you're just like, oof. These 3 or 4 things that are really wrecking me here, and you try to wrangle with it a little bit, and sometimes you can't get the results you want. And like I find that to be a point where it's like, all right, scrap this thing. I have 3 or 4 prompts in my mind that I know I'm going to get really close back to where I am with the stuff that I do like. So I'll abandon throw out those 3 or 4 prompts, get back to where I want to be, and then take it home. And that's kind of what happened here with this Richemont deal.
Yeah, I found that using these AI tools is equal parts amazing fun, but also frustration. And so I'm curious, in the process of putting this together for your clients, like what was that experience like? What did you learn as you iterated in these different prototypes?
I think that, for me, the thing I've learned, I don't know if I've learned something through those iterations. I think maybe how to use the tools better, and everything's moving so fast. I think what I have learned is not directly related to the tools, but more so the technology is that, it's very leverageable in these early stages or with smaller things that are commercializable. Larger platforms, larger apps, I think that it would be a tall order or a very painful couple of months to try to do entirely through vibe coding. But, with the rate of progression on generative AI, I expect that to be very different by this time in 2026. I think that the thing that I've learned is that it's very good with where it's at for particular candidate use cases. And, I think that my muscle memory of building software for the last 20 years or so has helped me kind of, use the force, if you will, to say, okay, this is a good use case, this is not a good use case. But I think that will fade, and that, that disparity between like these really small prototypes and apps that are totally doable, or websites that are totally doable, front to end vibe coding, and then like these larger apps and platforms that, just could not be done with vibe coding. I think we're going to see that gap continue to just close over the next year considerably and very quickly at that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's obviously advancing quite rapidly. You can stop sharing your screen, by the way, and we can just...
There's one last thing I wanted to show you, which was actually one of the smaller things. It's not something commercial, but it's actually, my a family member of ours has a travel agency, and this is actually, I get asked every now and then to help out with a website with my background. So this is actually something that's deployable now, and we're going to deploy this week. But this was basically, I would say, all in all, maybe about 2 hours worth of going back and forth. I think if we were to do this with a traditional WordPress template or a framer or something like that, it'd at least be like a 5 to 6 hour effort. But this was about 2 hours or under. Strictly vibe coded, all on Lovable. And this is a travel agency website for a family member of ours. And we're going to deploy this week. But really, it's a full-fledged website, and it's very robust. We do obviously have some muscle memory now on, the orders of prompts and, how to manage the generation of a site like this through vibe coding. But this is where, I see a lot of the magic in the next year is the, total democratization of creating sites like this for your everyday small business owner or, your everyday kind of tinkerer, where really you would have had to have some experience in the past of, putting together a smaller website or whatever it may be, to get something that's, multi-paged, has, or more robust navigation on it, etc. Now this is totally democratized, right? If you're adventurous and you're willing to fire up Lovable and hack away for a couple of hours, you could get yourself a really, really nice looking website up. And, from a lot of the small business websites I see today, that's a huge opportunity for people.
Yeah.
To me, this is exciting stuff.
The trend of our ability to make apps, software, websites is continuing to become more accessible. If you think about originally what it took to make a website, you had to know how to code, and then we had Wix and Squarespace, and then now Webflow and Framer, and now Lovable and Bolt, and various other platforms that exist. So that said, you made this for a family member, but the family member did not make it themselves, right?
They did not.
Okay. So do you think that she could do it herself?
Absolutely. And that's why I say if you're a little bit more adventurous, right, and exploratory, I think that, people who have zero technical background would find it very surprising what they're able to create in this day and age.
I agree. So earlier you mentioned your 20 years building software.
Yeah.
And part of the reason that I'm starting this podcast is because I think we're just at an incredibly exciting moment in the narrative around, and not just narrative, but our ability to create software. The nature of software creation is changing for the better.
Absolutely.
And you were part of the early mobile app revolution. Could you take us back to that moment around 2009 when you started your one of your first companies, and
Sure.
what that was like, what you saw there?
Sure. I mean, it was a really exciting time. Some of us had believed that the mobile computing revolution was coming for a long time. Me, for maybe 10 years before the iPhone, I was carrying a Palm Pilot, in my pocket in school, like in high school. And to me, it was a very exciting time, but really the ability to create was kind of locked off to kids like myself. I wasn't playing sports. I was spending a lot of time in the computer labs, building all sorts of, nonsensical, applications, websites, graphics, just, fueling my natural interest in building stuff, right? And a lot of the people I know who ended up, building software today, were similarly dispositioned, just because it was a bit intimidating in those days, right? I think that, for me, I started off like in the GeoCities era, right? So my first couple of websites were when GeoCities was huge and people had all sorts of nonsensical websites. And then I got a copy of Front Page 98. And I was going back and forth between code and visual editor on putting websites together. So Front Page 98, I'm probably dating myself right now, Cosmo.
Yeah, I don't know what that is.
Microsoft-based visual website editor, okay? And basically you could build websites and you could burn it from both ends. You could mess with the visual editor, mess with the code, and most of the times to end up with something that you wanted, you would be burning it from both ends. And that, kind of evolved into, me using Dreamweaver, which was another tool where you would burn things from both ends, the visual end as well as the code-based end. And, it was really like you had to be deep, right? You had to be spending your days on this stuff, right? To get a website like what we just looked at, like Global Travel Boutique Up, that's at least 2 months worth of learning back in the day. And, today, you could get that in under 2 hours if you're creative. So I think that where we were at in 2008 was very similar to where I cut my teeth in those early days, like 98, 2000, where, you really need to be very passionate, get into the details, learn the material, and then apply it. And today, it just feels very different. You just need some basics, you need good instincts, and you need an idea. and the tools are available for you to at least realize the initial version of your vision. So I feel that it feels very different than it did in '08. '08 was exciting for people who are very software dispositioned already, and people who already had a vested interest in the evolution of computing. I think that a lot has changed since 2008 because computing has eaten so much, and people are just computer native from the time they're born. I think my daughters have been on their iPads since they were 1 or 2, and I think that now it's important to everybody. And I think that's really the big difference, is that in '08, you had to know. You had people maybe in the business world had an inkling this is going to change the business environment of the United States and the world. But really, they didn't know on the level that they do today. And because people are so digitally native today and the tools are so much more democratized, I would say it's important for everybody. And that's what the main difference is to me in the vibe.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I remember being extremely excited about the iPhone when it came out, and then when the App Store became a thing. And, I was a tech nerd, and I was excited about apps, but I never took it upon myself to actually learn how to make them. So I was watching it grow from afar. And one thing I think that no one really, at least I didn't expect, was just the profound impact of app design and production, and like the way that can enable businesses to be formed on culture, and how infused technology has become within culture as a result. So
Absolutely.
When you got into making apps, in the very early first couple of years, was it simply just like you were excited about wanting to make your own apps on the phone? Like what about it got you into it? Did you ever imagine what it could become, what it is today?
Yeah, I think for me it was twofold, right? There was this personal desire and this almost childlike want for a really robust computer in my pocket that I'd had since I was maybe 9 or 10 years old. And then the other aspect of it for me was that I could see very clearly the business case, and I knew that the iPhone was going to be the device to rule them all. And I'd been, I had the advantage of, I was an Apple fanboy, pre all of the second era of Steve Jobs. My first computer was an Apple II GS. And then when Steve, went back to Apple and the new generation of iMacs came out, I got rid of my Fujitsu laptop real quick and I got one of those new iMacs. So I had been following the evolution of Apple for a number of years at that point. And to me, I was very sure in my mind that the iPhone was going to be a world-changing device. There were a lot of rumors for years up to that, about a phone, and people were hoping. But to me, it was twofold. It was a personal passion about having a robust computer in our pockets that, could do all of these things. And then, correlated, but, on a separate thread almost at that point in my mind, I think I must have been 21 or 22 at that point, Cosmo, was that this was going to be a major shift in the way the world works. And, to me, the combination of the two was just where do I sign up and how do I start creating? So.
And do you see a similar shift now with vibe coding and the tools that we have available? Perhaps it's not nearly as obvious to most people because there's not really a hardware device that's oh, this is the AI device. I mean, we've seen the AI pin, we've seen, the rabbit and all that. And we know that OpenAI is working on their own hardware. So I for sure believe that, there's going to be some incredible AI native hardware breakthroughs. But yeah, what's your take on the way in which vibe coding kind of will expand within the culture with hardware, perhaps?
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. It's less discernible because there's less of the hula balang around the hardware device and everybody adopting this new hardware device. But if you take a step up and you look at like the macro evolution of computing, I think it's very similar. We're going through a major paradigm shift like we did in '08 with the move from, desktop computers to, the internet in a mobile form available to everybody all the time, which is really what enabled all of this crazy shift around us over the last 20 years. I think that's very similar with AI as we see like it's disrupting, workflows at software companies like mine today. And I can only imagine that it's going to get way more pervasive. And we just talked about the vibe coding aspect of generative AI today. We're employing generative AI very deeply on the design aspect of what we're doing as well. And it's really disrupting the way we do things, and it's changing the way we do things. So I think it's very, very, very similar. I think that device shift thing is sticky, man, because of the iPhone. I think that most computing mediums, typically, and I could be wrong, somebody way wiser than me may say different, but I think computing mediums typically take a long time to get adopted overall. And I think that we're starting to see the decoupling of mediums with the underpinning software and technology. And I think in the future, perhaps there won't be one device to rule them all. And we're still like looking at things like everybody's going to wear glasses and like that's going to be the computing medium of the future. But I actually think that we're moving into like this like decoupled, decentralized computing era where, I'm going to interact with a slab when it's appropriate. I'll have my glasses when it's appropriate. I'm going to talk to my way more advanced, Alexa or Siri when appropriate. And I think that, all of these different mediums play a role in our life. So I think this device coupling thing, perhaps the iPhone was the last time that happened, because I think now that semiconductors are dead cheap and there's all of these different form factors people are thinking about, I think we're entering this era where there's going to be devices that are more pervasive, but really people are going to interact with computers and what's comfortable for them. And I think that's super interesting to me.
Well, what do you mean by decoupling? I mean, I get that there's, a whole ecosystem of different technologies we use today, but yeah.
The vast majority of us have been driven, the population's been driven by particular form factors. So initially up front, 76, 77 until 96, almost everybody's working on desktop computers. You've got a tower, a monitor and a keyboard, and everything that's happening in the software world is totally boxed by the form factor, right? And then you evolve, there's laptops along the way, etc. And then the next major evolution becomes mobile, right? And you've got all of this interesting new software that's possible because of this device. But really, the advancements in hardware are driving the advancements in software, and software is driving the advancements in hardware. And they're burning each other very directly. But I think now, we've reached this point where, like you said, there's going to be a really great voice device, or the Apple Watches are getting more robust, or these holy grail glasses everybody is talking about, are right up on the horizon. People, that your possibilities for the applications you use and how you interact with them. If I want to, whatever the future social network is, if I want to interact with the Instagram of the future, it's not going to be just relegated predominantly to a mobile phone experience. There's going to be a multitude of ways to interact with it, and it's going to be useful to me in a multitude of ways. So that's kind of what I see in my mind, is that, yes, there's been other computing mediums along the way with the desktop and then the mobile, etc. But the lion's share has been ruled by the desktop in the first era and then the mobile phone in the second era. But I think now in this third era, we're going to see some people choose to interact with glasses, some people choose to interact with slabs, some people choose to interact with voice assistants, and we're going to see a lot more personalization in the way we use our computers on a day-to-day basis.
So I want to focus a bit on XR and its intersection with AI. You've been on the cutting edge of technology for many decades, coding your own custom websites, then moving into mobile, and then getting into XR pretty early as well as I did. Now we have the prospect of, AR glasses coming out. They're not fully quite here yet. And this has been one of those things that's taken, I think, a lot longer than people would have hoped or expected. But now there's this resurgence in interest around XR, in particular with some of the prototypes that Google has been showing, with the cameras and the microphones and its ability to remember what you've looked at. And of course, there's a whole host of privacy concerns. Snap is coming out with their consumer specs next year. Yep. And, you've spent a lot of time working in the XR space within the enterprise sector. So where do you see the intersection of XR and AI, and like what's most exciting to you?
Sure. I think that, as you understand as well, coming from, an XR past, and getting deep there, creation in XR is super difficult and super time and resource intensive. And I think that that's the first bit that I think is super exciting, is the ability to create, the metaverse people speak of requires a lot of work. And if everything is going to be done manually by hand, it's probably never going to come to fruition. And all of the experiences and the core value props that spatial technology provide us, I don't think will be realized without, generative AI. So I think that generative AI is almost like a nitro boost for VR and XR in a number of ways. So that's the first bit that's super exciting to me. The second bit is actually in experience and, more close to the Kinemeric work we're doing. It's the ability for AI to enable us to create more believable experiences and simulations. And that to me is really where the intersection is most meaningful today, is, creating more experiences and creating better experiences.
So using AI within a spatial environment to create the world that you're looking at.
Absolutely. Or even if it's more manual up front today, right, Cosmo, putting together like a believable environment or a nice environment is typically a highly intensive effort for the technical artists and the art teams. But with some of the tools that are starting to get to a mature point today, you could get a base tree model, in a couple of seconds, and then optimize the mesh however you'd like or whatever it may be. Today, you're kind of have to go from scratch or buy somebody's asset and customize it, which, there's arguments for both, but, in both cases, generative AI enables a better result. And that to me is exciting.
Yeah. And so you mentioned generative AI within Kinemeric. Like, how are you using it in your pipeline?
So today we are using it in a number of ways. We use it to storyboard different kinds of deployments and applications of our technology. So that's on the art side, number one. And then number two, as we spoke about, is a lot of our technology rests on LLMs. So, we're able to create rails for our believable humans or agents that we spoke about, but a lot of the variability and dynamicism in the conversations is because of the underpinning LLM technology. And that, to me, starts to create more believable experiences.
Yeah, certainly, the introduction of LLMs has made virtual humans far more practical and useful. Have you had any insightful or like kind of profound experiences talking to AIs, either within Kinemeric or perhaps ChatGPT or anything like that?
I mean, I say profound lightly because I don't stop to necessarily think about it sometimes, but as we've progressed into creating these believable humans and we want them to act in particular ways, and you're kind of working with an LLM, fine-tuning it, and then prompt engineering on top of it to get the results you want, it forces you to start to break down the way humans kind of behave and react and look to the psychology of, what kind of matters to a human in a conversation in a number of ways. So to me, that's really what has been revealing is that, sometimes you may prompt the LLM in one way or another and not quite get the results that you want. And then, really there's a play testing effort to kind of fine tune the results you want. And with our stuff, there's a master structural prompt, but that prompt has tons of variables and additives in it to actually get the results that we want on top of the fine-tuned model. So for us, we expect to get a result sometimes, especially when we've been on a particular track and we're seeing incremental advancement in the behavior. And then you do something that seems very natural, and then you start to get unnatural results. So that to me has been a little bit of a learning lesson as to like taking a step back and thinking about like what's the best way to, structure our prompts to get those believable results. And there's a lot of play testing in that, Cosmo.
Yeah. Do you find that people are comfortable and able to speak with these AIs similar to a way that they speak with humans?
That's been like the sweetest part to us. Like, in the first couple of deployments we've done, we've been going deep on analysis of the sessions and listening to a lot of sessions in like great detail. And like, there's definitely some very magical moments in there, like a lot of fun moments as well. But there's definitely, we see in the majority of cases, actually, the trainee, after their first session and the novelty of the experience wears off, we actually see them go in there and have very meaningful conversations and, go, 12 to 14 minutes in a session and really, really start to, get into that sales mode. And, to us, that's really the magic right there, where, their guard is falling and they're really kind of able to go back and forth with the agent, and the conversations are really, really meaningful.
Yeah, I that's awesome. I love using ChatGPT voice mode. It continues to improve and sound more natural.
Oh, yeah.
And I would imagine that there's a significant difference and also challenge in when you're in a spatial environment, when that voice is embodied in a virtual character, right? Because the ChatGPT is just like an animated abstract blue sphere thing. Right. But with your app in Kinemeric, they're virtual humans, right? So how do you pair that LLM voice technology with a human in a way that is not creepy and actually like fun and useful?
Yeah, so it goes back to what we were talking about previously, right? It's, with the typical interface that people are interacting with voice mode on GPT today, you're dead on, right? It's an abstract visualization. There is no possible uncanny valley, but with what we're doing, there is. So it goes back to, making sure that the avatars look as good as they can for the target platform, making sure that there's an interpretive layer that actually looks at what the LLM's output is going to be and is able to map it to an appropriate animation framework so that the animations actually correlate with what the believable humans are saying. And then that's just body language. Facial, animation is a whole another world of pain, but also tremendously important. So really, it's about balancing all of those things. And it goes back to what I call a believable human, because targeting the kinds of devices we do today, like the Quest 3, you're limited, on the amount of compute you have available. So how do you find the right balance of all of these factors to create a meaningful simulation for the user? And that's going to continue to evolve as these devices get better.
Yeah. So, we've spoken a lot about the positives of this type of interaction with AI. What are some of the risks or the challenges either today or, things that, you think about in the future? One that comes to mind is like the growing, trend of like AI boyfriends or girlfriends. Like that's something that concerns me. It's fascinating, but also, if just like logically playing this out, humans are lonely, and we the AI continues to improve and sound more natural, and is either embodied virtually or physically.
Yeah, we're not. Spike Jonze movie.
Right. Yeah, we're quite close. It feels to me. And is that something that ever concerns you, or like how do you think about that?
I mean, it does, right? I think that this is a larger philosophical conversation, but I think that the definition of technology has been perverted in society today. And I think that in its most purest form, technology started off as like a really flat rock that was good to break nuts open with, on a plane in Africa somewhere. And really, it was about accentuating something we were doing already as a species.
Mhm.
And I think today, technology sometimes instigates or creates new behaviors altogether that are maybe not accentuating or, creating a greater efficiency with a behavior that we're doing innately. And I think that's where we start to get into a little bit of trouble, right? The technology should be helping to aid the species' natural disposition, not throw the species off on a different track like doom scrolling. Like doom scrolling is not technology, right? Like the technology that enables doom scrolling is not technology, right? And, to me, like it is technology, but it's not technology. And I think that that's, to me, the scary area. In a more direct way, I have less concerns because as a mission of Kinemeric, we've been careful to position ourselves to only employ these tools where they're additive to, real human exchanges and real human experiences. For us, one of the biggest things that we surfaced when we were doing initial research on the platform was that there's a great desire from corporate trainers and learning specialists throughout the United States to have the ability to do more role play training with their trainees. And in a lot of cases, they are just way too resource limited, or they don't have an apparatus that allows them to do so. So our technology enables that, but really it's all about having better exchanges with colleagues, customers, subordinates, in a real life scenario with real people, ultimately. So for us, it's less of a direct concern because our technology is useless if there's no way to apply it to a real human afterwards. Okay, but in the larger, grander sense, as a technologist, I do have real concerns about where we're going. And not sure, how you kind of slow things down, right? I think that maybe we're due for a larger introspection as a species, right? They taught us about the Luddites in school when we were kids. And I'm not in any way advocating for anything like that, but I do think that it would be fair for us as a species to take a little bit of a step back and be a little bit more conscious as to how technology is affecting us. Jaron Lanier wrote a really good book a number of years ago called 10 Arguments for Deleting Your Social Media Accounts Right Now. And I think that, more of those cautionary voices are going to be important, over the next decade and perhaps even longer. There are major changes that are going to occur in the global economies, in day-to-day life, over the next 5 to 10 years that are very real. And I think that we just need to be analyzing, our decisions collectively as a species as closely as possible, because there may be unintended results here. And I think that we're taking it a little bit too lightly right now.
Well said. Yeah. Technology can be used for good and evil. And I completely agree. Like, AI is tremendously powerful. And I prefer not to dwell on the negative. I consider myself more of an optimist, but it's also, but I'm also not naive in ignoring the very real risks of this technology. And so I see the dark side to it as well, in particular with, the prospect of replacing human relationships with AI. I find that to be very disturbing, at least as a theory. And to what degree that becomes reality is up to us. And that's, part of what inspires me to do this podcast and to build what I'm building is, to be a force for good within this space. And yeah, I mean, what's that?
So that's what's up, Cosmo. So
inevitably, there will be unintended consequences. Just as an example, you hear about Johnny Ive and Lorraine Powell Jobs commenting about how there were the I guess the negative externalities of the iPhone that they could never have predicted, which I think is pretty reasonable. I mean, it's like, they made this great piece of technology, but they could not have foreseen the way in which Facebook would use it, or Snapchat or Uber and all this. And I think we're at a similar point with AI, where there's already tremendous good coming out of it and also tremendous risk.
Absolutely.
And I prefer to stay relentlessly focused on, how can we use this to elevate ourselves instead of, create more addiction. So yeah, I appreciate your perspective.
Same. I am very agreeable to what you said. The tools should enable us to spend more time with our families, more time in nature, doing the things that we care about ultimately. Yeah.
Exactly. And I find it fascinating, whatever Sam Altman and Johnny Ive are up to regarding their AI hardware, because they talk about this problem as something that they're looking to address. Now, to what degree that it will actually make our lives better and versus just addict us to something new, we'll see, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But just jumping into the future, so you've seen this trajectory over the last several decades, going from fully custom built, having to learn to code yourself, and into the mobile revolution, then XR, and now we have AI and vibe coding. Like, how do you see all this technology evolving, either within the enterprise, specific to Kinemeric, or just more broadly, as a cultural force?
Sure, that's a good question. So I think we touched upon a number of things that I would kind of, roll into this answer here. But I do think that we are entering, an era of decoupled or decentralized kind of computing, where, I may interact with a really rich computer in my car, or, a voice computing interface in my living room, and then, a slab-based computer or glasses when I'm on the go. So to me, I think that where we're going is a place of tremendous personalization, both from an application stack and a device stack kind of place, where, what works for me really works for me, and I'm able to do everything that I need to, and, partake in society and the organizations I'm a part of to my comfort level. And the tools enable that and make it, as seamless as possible. So I do think that that's kind of where we're headed right now, Cosmo. That's the next era.
Yeah, I agree. More personalization, and the way in which AI can enable that is very exciting.
I think we have most of the form factors that, have been spoken about in the sci-fi lore of the past. I think the one thing that maybe is not quite there, from even a primitive standpoint, is holographic displays. But even then, you're seeing some interesting work at Looking Glass, and then there's a number of other ones that are out there today. But I think that, from a glasses standpoint, there's a number of people who are working on it. From a fully immersive standpoint, there's a number of people working on it. From a voice computing layer, there's some very impressive results today, and a number of people working on it as well. From traditional computing mediums, I don't see anybody who's really knocking Apple out of that place immediately, but I think they continue to persist for at least a couple of decades. So really, that's what I see: greater customization, greater democratization. Like, the whole thing about having a stack of apps that are just for you, I think that that's very real. I think people don't realize how possible that is today, but I do have one or two apps that I've cooked up for myself, like a little Bhagavad Gita app where I get, a little saying every morning, etc. I think that's where we're headed.
It's well said. It's super interesting, like this concept of personal and dynamic apps. Right now, the paradigm is one where we invest a lot of resources to create an app and put it on the App Store, download it, and maybe find it or don't find it. And perhaps in the future, we might be vibe coding our apps into existence on the spot.
Yeah.
Do you see something like that?
Absolutely. I think in a lot of use cases that's going to be the go-to. There's obviously going to be platforms that you're going to want to be a part of because there's just a critical, mass of people there and the network effects in play. But I think for a lot of other utilities and things that we may leverage on our iPhones today, rather than downloading something out of the App Store and paying 99 cents or whatever it may be, and it's kind of a good fit, you could spend 15 minutes vibe coding your own solution, and use that forever and iterate on it however is best and how you evolve as a person as well.
Yeah. I think it's a good place to wrap it up. Where can people learn more about you or Kinemeric and your work?
So we're putting up a new Kinemeric website, but kinemeric.com is the website. And then you could
Really spell that?
KINEMERIC. And then you could find me on X. My handle is just Ashwin K. Gobindram.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Ash. I really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you all for joining us on this very first beautiful episode of Vibe Coding. You can learn more and subscribe at vibe-coding.fm, and we'll see you soon. Thank you for listening.